While the United States was struggling and falling behind in the shadow of red, the Soviet Union was making the most important scientific discovery. This simply was not accepted by nationalist, American exceptionalists, and the United States Congress. On July 29, 1958, Dwight D. Eisenhower signed the National Aeronautics and Space Act. After several Soviet accomplishments in the conquest of space in the 1950s, the United States decided to take a stance to show American dominance in all areas tactically and physically by creating the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, to control and maintain their own organization for space travel. Because of the large amount of early successes created by NASA, the space race became much more intense. This event was also the turning point for Americans in both the space race and everyday life, as we can still see its effects today. Beginning in the mid-20th century, the Cold War was a time for military and political tensions between mainly the two powerhouses, the Soviet Union and the United States. Previously, the United States joined an alliance called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. All of the members agreed upon collective security, where an attack on one was an attack on all. Historian Paul Johnson says it was the single most effective in keeping the peace for half a century and more. This security was one of Dwight Eisenhower's three main focuses during the Cold War. The other two were strengthening science and military and pursuing peace. He focused on these because of the increased threat of the Soviet Union launching missiles aimed at the United States. Increased attacks on American planes and bombers were the reason Eisenhower wanted to increase the use of science so Americans can stay ahead in military weaponry. He did this through the National Science Foundation for Research in January 1958, only 6 months before NASA came about. The first artificial Earth satellite was called Sputnik. It was created by the Soviet Union and was put into orbit on October 4, 1957. This was the most important event involved in space exploration because it made the United States realize its need for their own accomplishments. During this time, the American people felt as if they needed their trust and confidence to be reassured because the feeling of being second to a communist community was startling. This great fear was struck over the American people and was encouraged and provoked by Senator Joseph McCarthy. His idea that communists, mainly Soviets, are inferior to Americans was called McCarthyism, and the time period is now labeled as the Red Scare. It led people to believe that if they could win the space race, then there's a real threat of communist takeover. The US government knew it couldn't risk any more advancements from the Soviet Union before they even had an organization to put them at the same level. That's why Dwight Eisenhower decided to establish a new federal agency to oversee the nation's civilian and space aeronautics programs. He encouraged and requested that Senate Majority Leader Lyndon B. Johnson work with the rest of Congress to discuss the creation of such an organization. Finally, on July 29th, the National Aeronautics and Space Act of 1958 was signed. In the bill, the purpose is stated by saying, Congress declares that the general welfare and security of the United States require that adequate provision be made for aeronautical and space activities. The program created was called National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. Within this administration was the Aeronautics and Space Council, which included Eisenhower, the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of Defense, along with others. The entirety of the United States let out a huge sigh of relief during this summer because the trust and confidence that Eisenhower said needed to be restored was. It was now clear that the United States had created a turning point in the space race as they created NASA. Thanks to this giant stance in American history by President Eisenhower and his Congress, NASA easily created their own goals for exploration, which were study and use satellites for human benefit and get a man to fly in space. It didn't take long for NASA to get to work as it became operational on October 1st, the same year it was created. 10 days later, they successfully launched their first spacecraft called Pioneer 1. For the next 5 months, because of a lack of enthusiasm from the so-called lame duck President Eisenhower, the two sides combined had a total of 2 launches, both of which caused no spark. NASA decided to begin moving forward with its own manned spaceflights, and on April 9th, named the 7 astronauts that would take part in the Mercury missions aimed to put a man in orbit.
In my hometown. hometown is Sparta, Wisconsin, and my age is 35, and I'm in the Air Force. As far as my motivation is concerned, I feel that this is the future of not only this country, but the world.
The feelings expressed by these men were shared amongst the whole country because of the excitement of reclaiming the title of the most scientifically advanced country. Before these flights would be ready, however, NASA made sure to keep providing and created the first communication satellite on August 12th. President Eisenhower made a short speech using this satellite, and he says that this was the boost he was looking for NASA to make. He says, "It is a great personal satisfaction to participate in this first experiment in communications involving the use of the satellite balloon known as ECHO. This is one more significant step in the United States program on space research." 3 days later, the Soviet Union stunned the world with the launch of the very first man in space, Yuri Gagarin, in 1961. This mission was called Vostok 1 and involved a 1 hour and 48-minute orbit of Earth's atmosphere. This accomplishment was broadcast all over the media, such as newspapers like the Huntsville Times, who showed lots of excitement for what had happened, but also said that the United States came so close but yet so far because they hoped to get there first. It is said that because of a Sputnik satellite in Earth orbit in 1957, followed by Yuri Gagarin in 1961, the Soviet Union had a clear lead in the exploration of space frontier. The month following this giant Soviet accomplishment, the United States responded with their own suborbital flight of Alan Shepard. This was the most important flight in American history as it meant that the human space flight was conquerable by the U.S. The newly elected President John F. Kennedy reflected on his idea in an address to Congress 20 days after Shepard's flight.
Obtained by the Soviets with their large rocket engines, which gives them many months of lead time, and recognizing the likelihood that they will exploit this lead for some time to come in still more impressive successes, we nevertheless are required to make new efforts on our own. For while we cannot guarantee that we shall one day be first, we can guarantee that any failure to make this effort will make us lost.
His most memorable words were that he wanted to put a man on the moon before the decade was out. Everyone felt the power of Kennedy's words because he was so eager to win this race. Even the media spread his ideas. He was really pushing NASA to get this done because he believes in them because of how quickly they went from a baby organization to having a man in space. After changing the direction of fortune during the intense years of the space race, NASA continued to strive to achieve what Kennedy wanted. There was less pressure now because the Cold War had thawed out and President Lyndon B. Johnson realized now that he needed to use expenses for the Vietnam War. Space travel was now at free will with no fear of competition. However, NASA did end up putting a man on the moon before the decade was out, as Kennedy wanted. This was achieved through Gemini and Apollo projects. The Gemini projects were to test to see how safe it would be to send the man to the moon. After 12 successful Gemini missions, NASA decided to get started with the Apollo project, which involved the actual sending of astronauts to the moon. On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Edwin Buzz Aldrin became the first humans to walk on the moon. This was obviously a very triumphant achievement for NASA and for the country. The city of New York held a parade to celebrate the 3 men involved in the mission. The famous words, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," came from this journey and represented what this flight meant for space travel. Leading up to this flight and following it, tension had thawed out for the official end of the space race came when the Soviets and Americans had a joint mission called the Soyuz Apollo project. They launched from 2 different sites but came together while in space to have lunch and collect experiments. Before the United States even had a program to organize and to conduct space-related experiments, the Soviet Union had taken over this frontier with the launch of Sputnik. In response to this situation, President Eisenhower met with Congress to create such an organization called NASA, which astonishingly stood in the way of more Soviet accomplishments by doing them first. Other than having the first man in space, the Soviet Union was beat out by the will and determination of NASA. This stance opened doors for what led to be the future, which now includes radio satellites, weather satellites, and hurricane trackers, all because NASA came to be.